It is 1930. In India, a 70-year-old man decides to walk 240 miles to pick up a handful of salt from the ocean. This simple act sparks a revolution that brings down the largest empire in human history. Tonight, we unravel the life of Mahatma Gandhi, the man who proved that an empire built on force could be defeated without firing a single shot. He called his method Satyagraha, truth, force, and with it, he liberated 300 million people from colonial rule. How did a London-trained lawyer who once desperately wanted to be English become the Mahatma, the great soul, who showed the world a new way to fight injustice? Why did the man who united Hindus and Muslims in common cause die heartbroken, watching his beloved India torn apart by the very divisions he'd spent his life trying to heal? The man who died by an assassin's bullet changed the world forever. Martin Luther King would go on to study his methods. Mandela carried his books to prison. Every peaceful revolution since has followed the path he carved. In tonight's episode, we'll trace how a shy boy from Gujarat became the conscience of humanity. We'll discover why Einstein called him a miracle, why Churchill despised him, and how his assassination at a prayer meeting became the moment India truly understood what it had lost. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. Now, settle in as we begin to explore the life of the lawyer who became a liberator and the man who freed a nation only to watch it fracture along the very lines he'd spent his life trying to erase. This is the bedtime biography of Mahatma Gandhi. Chapter 1. The Formative Years in Kathiawar. Mohandas Gandhi arrived in the world on October 2nd, 1869, in the coastal town of Porbandar. The town sat quiet on the Arabian Sea, its white limestone houses catching the morning light. His family belonged to the Baniya caste, traders by tradition, though the Gandhis had taken a different path. For 3 generations they'd served as Diwans, chief ministers to the small princely states that dotted Kathiawar. His grandfather, Uttam Chand Gandhi, had been Diwan of Porbandar. When the Queen Regent turned against him and sent soldiers to his house, he fled to another state. Years later, when asked to serve its ruler, he offered his salute with his left hand. The right hand, he said, still belonged to Porbandar. Such gestures mattered in those small kingdoms, where honor counted more than wealth. Mohandas's father, Karamchand, served as Diwan too. A short, stocky man who'd never learned to read beyond the basics, he possessed something rarer than book learning. He understood people, understood how to navigate the dangerous waters between British power and princely pride. The year of Mohandas's birth brought particular tensions. The local ruler, Rana Vikmatji, had ordered the murder of a slave and an Arab soldier. The British responded by stripping him of his gun salute, a humiliation that rippled through the court and into the Gandhi household. The house itself ran on two forces, prayer and vegetables. Mohandas's mother, Putlibai, belonged to the Pranami sect, which blended Hindu and Islamic elements in its worship. She wouldn't touch food without her daily prayers. She kept the hardest vows without complaint. During the 4-month rainy season of Chaturmas, she'd vow to eat only if she saw the Sunday. Her children would run outside, searching the cloudy skies. No sun today, they'd report. She'd smile and go without. The family ate no meat, no eggs. This wasn't unusual for Banyas, but Putlibai took it further. She'd fast for days, sometimes weeks. Young Mohandas watched her, this small woman who could deny herself anything and make it look easy. As a child, Mohandas was restless. His sister remembered him twisting dogs' ears for amusement. School in nearby Rajkot proved unremarkable. He missed classes, scraped through examinations. His matriculation results showed 40%, ranking 404th in the province, numbers that suggested nothing of what was to come. Adolescence brought rebellion through an unlikely friendship. Sheikh Mehtab stood taller, stronger, everything Mohandas wasn't. Mehtab had a theory about British power, which he shared through a popular verse. The mighty Englishman rules the Indian small, because being a meat-eater, he is 5 cubits tall. The logic seemed sound to a boy who barely reached his friend's shoulder. So Mohandas ate meat in secret. Goat curry cooked by Mehtab, consumed with the doors locked and curtains drawn. Each bite brought guilt. He imagined his mother discovering his betrayal, saw her face crumble. The experiment lasted a year before guilt won. Mehtab led him to other experiments too. A brothel in a narrow alley. The young Gandhi stood frozen in what he'd later call a den of vice. The woman working there had no patience for his terror. She threw him out. The shame would follow him for decades. At 13, he married Kasturba. Child marriage was common, but that didn't make it easier for either child. He loved her with the desperate intensity of adolescence, a love both passionate and possessive. He wanted to control where she went, whom she saw. She resisted with quiet determination. They fought. They reconciled. They were children playing at being adults. Then came the night that would haunt him forever. His father, Karamchand, lay dying. Mohandas had been massaging his father's legs, a son's duty, but desire pulled him away. He went to his pregnant wife's room. Minutes later, a servant knocked. "Your father has passed. If animal passion had not blinded me," Gandhi would write decades later, "I should have been spared the torture of separation from my father during his last moments." Kasturba miscarried weeks later. He blamed himself for that too. Carnal desire, he decided, had killed both his father's last blessing and his child. College in Bhavnagar brought only misery. The lectures droned. The other students came from different worlds. He lasted 5 months before returning home, another failure to add to the collection. The idea of London came from Mavji Dev, a Brahmin friend of the family. Becoming a barrister would take half the time of an Indian degree. With a London qualification, the Diwanship of Porbandar would be his for the asking. The elders of his caste gathered to forbid it. Crossing the black waters meant pollution, excommunication. But something had awakened in the boy who'd failed at everything. He would go. His mother extracted 3 vows before blessing his departure. No meat, no wine, no women. He swore to all 3. In September 1888, the 19-year-old sailed from Bombay. Behind him lay a world of small kingdoms and ancient rules, of child marriage and dead fathers. Ahead waited London, that great machine of empire. Between them stretched the Arabian Sea, black under the moonless sky. Chapter 2. The London Transformation. The journey to London was a string of firsts for the young man from Porbandar who had never before stepped on a ship. He kept a diary, noting with wonder the genius of a man who invented the Suez Canal and the strange sight of a treeless Aden. His fastidious Bania upbringing was immediately challenged. He was horrified by a sailor's dirty hands and preferred English bread to the man's handmade rotis. Upon arriving in the imperial metropolis, a city of 6 million people, he was given his first lesson in English etiquette by Dr. Pranjeevan Mehta. Do not touch other people's things. Do not ask questions as we usually do in India on first acquaintance. Do not talk loudly. Gandhi initially threw himself into becoming an Englishman, buying expensive suits from Bond Street, a silk top hat, and taking lessons in dancing, French, and elocution. This phase did not last. His quest was not just for social acceptance, but for a palatable meal. The turning point was his discovery of a vegetarian restaurant on Farringdon Street. In its window, he saw a copy of Henry Salt's plea for vegetarianism. Reading it, he became, for the first time, a vegetarian by choice. Salt's argument was moral, not just dietary. He argued for a growing sense that flesh-eating is a cruel, disgusting, unwholesome, and wasteful practice, and envisioned a future great republic that would not confine its beneficence to man, but would bring about the emancipation of animals. Gandhi found in the London Vegetarian Society an intellectual and social anchor. He started a local branch in his neighborhood and found his first English friends, like the Oxford-educated barrister Josiah Oldfield, with whom he shared a flat at 52 Street, Stevens Gardens. Together, they threw parties serving lentil soup and lectured at clubs on their gospel of peace and health. This community of dissenters became his university. Through them, he was introduced to new ideas and revisited his own traditions. With 2 English friends, he read Sir Edwin Arnold's English translation of the Bhagavad Gita, the Song Celestial, for the first time. They, in turn, introduced him to Theosophy, where he met its founder, Madame Blavatsky, and her famous disciple, Annie Besant. A vegetarian friend from Manchester gave him a copy of the Bible. While the book of Genesis sent him to sleep, the New Testament Sermon on the Mount went straight to my heart, teaching him, like the Gita, that renunciation was the highest form of religion. He also found his public voice here. His first published writings were not legal briefs, but a 6-part series for the vegetarian titled Indian Vegetarians, where he explained the intricacies of the caste system and Indian cuisine to an English audience. He chastised the wretched custom of infant marriage for weakening Indians, not their diet, and praised the simple, hardy life of the Indian shepherd. He qualified as a barrister in June 1891, but his true education had been in the company of London's gentle radicals. Gandhi returned to India, a qualified barrister, but his worldview had been fundamentally reshaped. He tried to set up a law practice in Bombay, but found it a tedious business and failed to get briefs. He was so nervous during his first court appearance that he froze and had to return his client's fee. Back in Rajkot, he made a modest income drafting petitions, but chafed at the local politics, particularly after being unceremoniously thrown out of a British official's office. He wanted somehow to leave India. The opportunity came from an unexpected quarter, a business dispute involving a wealthy Muslim merchant from his hometown who had a thriving business in a place called South Africa. It was an escape, a chance to see a new country, and a job. He had no idea he was stepping into a crucible of racial hatred that would test his newfound principles to their very limit. Chapter 3. An Unwelcome Arrival in South Africa. The ship from Bombay creaked into Durban harbour in May 1893. Gandhi stood at the rail, 23 years old, watching the unfamiliar coastline take shape through the morning haze. He'd come to work on a commercial lawsuit for Dada Abdullah and Company, a firm of Gujarati Muslim traders. 1 year, he thought, maybe less. What he found was a world carved into rigid categories. The British ran everything from their colonial offices. The Dutch-descended Boers controlled vast stretches of farmland. Native Africans worked the mines and fields under laws that dictated where they could walk, where they could live. And caught between these worlds were the Indians, about 50,000 of them in Natal alone. They called the plantation workers coolies, men and women who'd been shipped from India to cut sugarcane under 5-year contracts that bound them like invisible chains. The other Indians, the ones who'd paid their own passage, ran shops and trading houses. The whites called them passenger Indians, as if their ticket price determined their humanity. Gandhi's education in this strange arithmetic of race began immediately. He walked into a Durban courtroom wearing his turban. The magistrate stared. The other lawyers shifted in their seats. "Remove it," someone muttered. Gandhi kept it on. That evening, he wrote his first letter to an African newspaper, explaining that taking off a turban was as insulting to an Indian as asking a European to remove his trousers. But it was the train to Pretoria that would reshape everything he thought he knew about dignity. He'd bought a first-class ticket. The compartment was nearly empty when he settled into his seat with his legal papers. At Pietermaritzburg, a white passenger entered, took one look at Gandhi, and walked back out. Minutes later, a railway official appeared. "Third class," the official said. "For coloureds." Gandhi produced his ticket, first class, clearly printed. The official called for a constable. Together they lifted Gandhi by his arms and deposited him on the platform. His luggage followed, thrown after him like an afterthought. The train pulled away into the South African night. He spent hours in that dark waiting room, his overcoat still in his luggage, too proud to ask for it. The cold seeped through his English suit. Somewhere a clock ticked. He thought about returning to India on the next ship. He thought about the contract he'd signed. Mostly he thought about the look on the white passenger's face, as if Gandhi's very presence was a contamination. The humiliations multiplied on the journey's next leg. A coach driver refused to let him sit inside with the other passengers. "Sit on the footboard," the driver ordered. When Gandhi protested, the man boxed his ears. Gandhi grabbed the coach railings to keep from falling, enduring blow after blow while the white passengers watched in silence. Yet, on the final train to Pretoria, when another guard ordered him to third class, something unexpected happened. An English passenger spoke up. He had no objection to sharing his compartment with an Indian gentleman, he said. The guard retreated. Gandhi sat down, stunned by this small act of decency in an indecent world. If the train taught him about individual prejudice, the mob would teach him about collective rage. After his one-year contract concluded, he stayed on in Natal for 2 more years to organize the Indian community against discriminatory laws. He finally sailed back to India in 1896 to fetch his wife and children. While there, he wrote pamphlets describing conditions in Natal. Reuters mangled his words, cabling that Gandhi claimed whites were being stripped of their possessions by Indians. The distortion lit a fuse in Durban. When Gandhi's ship returned in December 1896, thousands of whites formed what they called a demonstration committee. For 3 weeks, the authorities held the ship in quarantine while the crowd grew larger, angrier. Editorials screamed about the Asiatic invasion. Men gathered at the docks with sticks and stones. On January 13th, 1897, they were finally allowed to land. Gandhi sent Kasturba and the children ahead in a closed carriage. He would walk in daylight with an English lawyer named Lawton. They barely made it past the dock gates. The mob surrounded them, pulling Lawton away. Mud splattered Gandhi's face. Stale fish struck his chest. Someone produced a horsewhip and lashed him across the back. They might have killed him there on the Durban street, but the police superintendent's wife, Mrs. Alexander, pushed through the crowd. She opened her parasol and stood beside the bleeding Indian lawyer, daring the mob to strike through her. The crowd hesitated. Police whistles sounded. The moment passed. Gandhi refused to identify his attackers. The gesture confused the white newspapers, even earned some grudging respect. But lying in bed that night, his ribs bruised and face swollen, he understood something fundamental had shifted. The polite letters he'd learned to write at the inner temple, the careful legal arguments, the appeals to British justice, none of it would be enough here. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be corrected with proper documentation. This was something else entirely. The lawsuit that brought him to Africa could wait. He had found a different kind of case. Chapter 4. The Merchants' Meeting. The farewell dinner was supposed to last 2 hours. Dada Abdullah had arranged everything at his home in Durban. The long table set with good china, the smell of biryani drifting from the kitchen. April 1894. And Gandhi's trunk was already packed for India. His contract was finished. The commercial case that had brought him to South Africa was settled. He'd earned his fee, £105, enough to set himself up properly back in Bombay. Someone passed him a newspaper during the fish course, a small article buried on page 4. The Natal Legislative Assembly was debating something called the Franchise Amendment Bill. It would strike Indians from the voters' roll. Gandhi read it aloud, translating from English into Gujarati for the merchants around the table. The room went quiet. These were wealthy men, owners of shops and warehouses, but they understood little of colonial law. They paid their taxes, ran their businesses, kept their heads down. Now the government wanted to ensure they could never vote, not them, not their sons, not their grandsons. One of the merchants, an elderly trader named Ahmed, set down his fork. "You must stay and help us," he said to Gandhi. "We don't know how to fight this." Gandhi explained he couldn't possibly stay. His passage was booked. His family was waiting, but as he spoke, he saw their faces. These men who'd built fortunes from nothing, who'd crossed black waters to make new lives, suddenly looked lost. By the time dessert arrived, the farewell party had become something else entirely. They were drawing up lists of names, discussing meeting spaces, arguing about funds. He agreed to delay his departure by 1 month, just long enough to help them organize a proper response to the bill. That month would stretch into 21 years, but sitting at that table, watching Ahmed's hands shake as he pledged £50 to the cause, Gandhi couldn't have known that. The Natal Indian Congress held its first meeting 3 months later in a rented hall that smelled of tobacco and damp. Gandhi had written the Constitution himself, copying sections from similar organizations he'd read about in London. The merchants elected Abdullah Haji Adam as president, a strategic choice, since Adam was rich enough to intimidate and respectable enough to reassure. Gandhi took the role of honorary secretary, which meant he did most of the actual work. His days fell into a pattern. Mornings in court, defending Indian shopkeepers accused of trading without licenses, or laborers beaten on sugar estates who somehow ended up charged with insubordination. Afternoons writing letters to colonial officials who rarely replied. Evenings in that stuffy hall, teaching English to merchants, explaining the intricacies of British constitutional law to men who'd never set foot in a British school. The petition against the franchise bill grew into something monstrous. 9,851 signatures by the final count. Volunteers went door to door through the Indian quarters, explaining what was at stake. Gandhi wrote to Dadabhai Naoroji, the Indian Member of Parliament in London, confessing his inexperience. The older man's reply was gentle but clear. The British Empire operates on precedent, not principle. Once a right is lost, it is almost impossible to regain. The local newspapers treated the whole effort as comedy. The Times of Natal suggested Gandhi should advertise his services directly rather than waste their readers' time with his letters about Indian rights. Another editorial compared the Indian population to rabbits, breeding rapidly and destroying everything in their path. When Gandhi submitted a reasoned response, arguing that Indians were British subjects entitled to British justice, the paper printed it under the headline, "Impertinence." He moved into a house on Beech Grove, living alone, eating simple vegetarian meals he cooked himself. The loneliness was useful. It gave him time to think, to write, to plan. He was developing a theory about how change happened in places like Natal, not through reason or moral argument, but through something else, something he couldn't quite name yet. The franchise bill passed anyway. The Colonial Assembly voted overwhelmingly to keep Indians off the voters' roll. All those signatures, all those carefully worded arguments about British justice and imperial citizenship, they might as well have been thrown into the Indian Ocean. But something had changed in that rented hall. The merchants and workers who'd gathered there had discovered they could act together, could speak with one voice, even if that voice was ignored. The real education was just beginning. Up north, in the Transvaal, the situation was worse. Gandhi would discover this soon enough when he moved to Johannesburg, where the prejudice was more naked, the laws more vicious, and the need for new methods more urgent. Chapter 5. Forging Satyagraha in the Transvaal. The Anglo-Boer War had ended, and the Indians of the Transvaal waited. They'd endured years under Boer laws that treated them like unwanted guests in the land they'd helped build. Now the British were in charge. Surely things would improve. They wouldn't. The new British administration proved even more methodical in its contempt. Where the Boers had been crude in their discrimination, the British brought bureaucracy, paperwork, systems. They brought the machinery of empire to bear on people who sold vegetables and cut hair and kept shops open late into the evening. August 1906, the government published something called the Draft Asiatic Law Amendment Ordinance. Indians had another name for it, the Black Act. Picture a law so comprehensive in its humiliation that it required every Indian, man, woman, child over 8 years old, to report to the authorities like criminals. 10 fingerprints, pressed into ink, a certificate to carry always, to produce whenever any policeman felt like asking. Forget it at home, prison, lose it, deportation. Refuse to get one, you could be thrown out of the country where you'd lived for decades. Gandhi read the ordinance in his law office in Johannesburg. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with something else. This wasn't just another law. This was an attempt to brand an entire people as criminals before they'd committed any crime. Death, he said aloud to his empty office, would be preferable to accepting this. The community stirred. Telegrams flew between Johannesburg and Pretoria, between Newcastle and Charlestown. Merchants closed their shops early to attend meetings. Hawkers abandoned their routes. Even the Chinese community, who faced the same law, sent representatives. September 11th, 1906. The Empire Theatre in Johannesburg. 3,000 people packed inside, more standing in the aisles, pressed against the walls. The September air hung thick with tobacco smoke and anxiety. Abdul Ghani, the chairman, stood first. A successful merchant who'd never been to prison, never broken a law. He spoke of going to jail, and the crowd erupted. Then Haji Habib, another merchant, rose from his seat. His voice carried across the packed theatre. He would swear an oath, he said, an oath to God. He would never submit to this law, no matter what came. Gandhi felt something shift in the room. This wasn't a political meeting anymore. These weren't protesters. They were becoming something else. He stood, and 3,000 pairs of eyes turned to him. He warned them, told them exactly what would happen. The government would take their businesses, their homes, they would go to prison, their families would starve, their children would cry for them at night, and they wouldn't be there. Was this really what they wanted? The fourth resolution. That's what history would call it. Gandhi asked everyone prepared to take an oath to God, to stand up, to pledge themselves to resist whatever the cost. The entire theatre rose, 3,000 people on their feet, hands raised, voices joining into one sound that shook the walls. Not a single person remained seated. Gandhi needed a word for what was happening. Passive resistance sounded weak, foreign. This was neither passive nor merely resistant. Satyagraha, that's what he would call it. Truth force, soul force. Not the weapon of the weak, but the power of those strong enough to suffer without striking back. July 1st, 1907. The permit offices opened their doors, ready to process Indians like cattle. They found empty waiting rooms. Outside, Indian pickets stood peacefully, speaking quietly to anyone who approached. Turn away, brother. Remember your oath. The first arrest wasn't Gandhi, wasn't even a political leader. Ram Sundar Pandit, a Hindu priest in Germiston, simply refused to leave his temple. They dragged him away while he chanted prayers. December 27th. Arrest warrants for Gandhi and 22 others. January 10th, 1908. Gandhi stood before a magistrate. Guilty, he said. 2 months simple imprisonment. His first time behind bars. Prison suited him strangely. He read, he thought, he wrote. Outside, hundreds more Indians filled the jails. General Jan Smuts, watching his prisons overflow, and his economy wobble as Indian businesses closed, asked for a meeting. They worked out a compromise in hushed conversations between a prison cell and a government office. Gandhi would register voluntarily, showing good faith. The law would be repealed. Everyone would go home. But when Gandhi tried to register to keep his end of the bargain, the violence came not from white officials, but from his own people. A Pathan named Mir Alam, feeling betrayed by the compromise, would nearly beat Gandhi to death on a Johannesburg street. The path of Satyagraha, Gandhi was learning, meant taking blows from all sides. Chapter 6. The Great March and Final Victory. The struggle had stretched on for years, sometimes flaring bright, sometimes smouldering quietly. But in 1913, 2 government actions lit a fire that would not be extinguished. First came the refusal to repeal the £3 tax. This annual burden fell on former indentured labourers in Natal who chose to stay as free residents after their contracts ended. £3 might sound modest today, but for workers earning pennies, it meant choosing between paying the government or feeding their children. Then came the second blow. A Cape Supreme Court judge named Searle issued a ruling that sent shockwaves through every Indian home in South Africa. Only Christian marriages, he declared, were legally valid. With a single stroke of his pen, thousands of Hindu and Muslim marriages became void. Wives became concubines in the eyes of the law. Children became illegitimate. Gandhi called it an insult to the honor of their womanhood. For once, his words weren't strong enough. The community had endured economic hardship, political humiliation, daily indignities, but this attack on the sanctity of family crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In the Gandhi household in Phoenix, a conversation unfolded that would change everything. Kasturba Gandhi had watched her husband's struggles for years, maintaining the home while he fought his battles. Now the battle had come to her doorstep. When told she would have to go to jail, her response was simple and absolute. I am prepared to go to jail. September 1913. Kasturba led 16 Satyagrahis from Phoenix across the border into the Transvaal. They knew what awaited them. The magistrate was efficient. 3 months hard labor for each woman. The authorities expected this would end the matter. Instead, it lit a powder keg. The sight of women behind bars, of mothers separated from their children, had what witnesses called an electrifying effect. If the wives and daughters of the community could endure prison, what excuse did the men have? The question rippled through the coal mines of Newcastle, through the sugar plantations of Natal. Workers began laying down their tools, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. The strike spread like wildfire through the Indian labor force. They demanded the repeal of the £3 tax. They demanded recognition of their marriages. They demanded dignity. Gandhi rushed to Newcastle, finding himself suddenly at the head of an army he hadn't recruited. These weren't trained Satyagrahis who had studied philosophy and practiced discipline. These were miners with coal dust in their lungs, plantation workers with backs bent from cutting cane, and they looked to him for leadership. His response was audacious. If the government wouldn't listen to petitions or small acts of resistance, perhaps they would listen to 2,000 men, women and children marching across the border. The Great March would begin on November 6, 1913, from the town of Charlestown. A journalist found Gandhi on the eve of the march at the back of an Indian store, standing in the yard, serving curry and rice to his followers. The lawyer who had once worn European suits and starched collars now ladled food like a common cook. The transformation was complete. As the march began, the scene was unlike anything South Africa had witnessed. Families walked together, carrying their few possessions. Children rode on their fathers' shoulders. Women who had never traveled beyond their plantations now walked toward an uncertain fate. When Gandhi's car passed stragglers on the road, they would raise their hands in salute, calling him Bapu, Father. The government wavered. Should they arrest 2,000 people? Where would they put them? But as the marchers pressed forward, the authorities' hesitation turned to action. Gandhi was arrested, then released on bail. He rejoined the march and was arrested again. Finally, the state unleashed its full force. Police intercepted the marchers and loaded them onto trains like cattle. But instead of prison, they were transported back to Natal, to their mines and plantations. The work sites were transformed into open-air prisons, surrounded by barbed wire fences. Under police and military guard, the strikers were forced back to work. The crackdown was brutal. Several strikers died in police firings. The images of workers behind barbed wire, of families separated, of bodies falling to bullets, reached newspapers in India and Britain. The empire that prided itself on civilization was shooting unarmed strikers. In Madras, Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy of India, delivered a speech that sent tremors through the colonial establishment. He publicly condemned the South African government's actions and demanded an impartial inquiry. When the Viceroy of India criticized a British dominion, the empire itself seemed to crack. General Smuts found himself trapped. International pressure mounted daily. The strikes were crippling the economy. The prisons couldn't hold everyone. Something had to give. He appointed the Solomon Commission to investigate Indian grievances and released Gandhi and other leaders to negotiate. The Indian Relief Bill of 1914 didn't grant everything the community wanted, but it delivered on the central demands. The £3 tax was abolished. Hindu and Muslim marriages were recognized. Wives and children of domiciled Indians could enter South Africa. After 21 years of struggle, a settlement had been reached. The young lawyer who had arrived in 1893 to handle a single case was leaving as something else entirely. He had forged a new weapon for political struggle and taught a community to wield it. The farewells were emotional. Indians gathered at stations and halls to bid him goodbye. Even some Europeans came to shake his hand. On July 18, 1914, Gandhi boarded the SS Kinfaus Castle. As the ship pulled away from the African coast, he carried with him the lessons of 2 decades. The techniques refined in South Africa would soon shake an empire on a scale nobody could yet imagine. Chapter 7. The Returning Hero and the Champaran Struggle. The ship pulled into Bombay Harbour on a January morning in 1915. After 20 years away, Mohandas Gandhi was coming home. But he wasn't returning as the quiet lawyer who'd left for South Africa 2 decades earlier. Word of his victories against racial discrimination had traveled faster than any steamship. At the port, the crowd pressed forward. Thousands had gathered since dawn. When Gandhi and his wife Kasturba finally appeared at the gangway, the cheering swelled into something almost physical. Garlands flew through the air. Rose petals and marigolds piled around their feet. More garlands landed on their shoulders, around their necks, until you could barely see their faces through all the flowers. That evening, the city's elite gathered at the Petit Mansion. High Court judges mingled with Parsi merchants. Muslim traders talked business with Hindu bankers. The marble floors gleamed. Crystal chandeliers cast light across silk saris and imported suits. Here was Gandhi, the man who'd taken vows of poverty, being toasted with champagne he wouldn't drink, honored at a feast he wouldn't eat. Sir Ferozeshah Mehta rose to speak. He praised Gandhi's courage, certainly, but then turned to Kasturba. She had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the fight and in the sufferings, he said. The room erupted in applause. Even political rivals had come together for this moment. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, the firebrand extremist, stood in the same room as Gopal Krishna Gokhale, the cautious moderate. A young lawyer named Muhammad Ali Jinnah took the podium at the Gujarati community reception. His words carried both praise and worry. Gandhi's strenuous and hard labor in South Africa had achieved remarkable things. But perhaps his return was a terrible loss to South Africa. There was nobody who could take his place and fight their battle. Gandhi listened to all the speeches, accepted all the honors, but he knew something his admirers didn't fully grasp. He understood South Africa better than he understood India. 20 years was a long time to be away. The country had changed. The freedom movement had evolved. He needed to learn his homeland all over again. Gokhale, his political mentor, had given him specific advice. Travel for a year. Watch. Listen. Learn. Don't jump into politics immediately. So Gandhi packed light and bought third-class train tickets from his native Kathiawar to the holy city of Haridwar, from Calcutta to Madras. Each stop taught him something new about the country's diversity and its problems. In Madras, where most of the Satyagrahis in South Africa had originated, the reception was extraordinary. A British official found Gandhi in a crowded third-class carriage, surrounded by bundles of old clothes, looking like a family of peasants. When his train arrived, The waiting crowd unhitched the horses from his carriage. Men grabbed the wooden poles and pulled the carriage through the streets themselves, their feet slapping against the dusty road, sweat streaming down their faces in the Chennai heat. It was during these travels that Gandhi confronted something that shook him. In the villages where indentured laborers had once lived before sailing to South Africa, he witnessed the reality of untouchability within Hinduism, the way certain people couldn't enter temples, couldn't draw water from the same wells, couldn't even let their shadows fall across the paths of upper caste Hindus. If it was proved to me that this is an essential part of Hinduism, he declared, I, for one, would declare myself an open rebel against Hinduism itself. His year of observation ended. Then, at the 1916 Congress session in Lucknow, a peasant named Raj Kumar Shukla appeared. Shukla was persistent in a way that bordered on desperate. He followed Gandhi from Lucknow to Kanpur, then all the way to his ashram in Ahmedabad. Day after day, the same plea, come to Champaran, see what the indigo planters are doing to us. The Tinkathia system Shukla described was brutal in its simplicity. British planters forced farmers to grow indigo on 3/20ths of their land. The farmers had no choice in the matter. The compensation was pitiful. The blue dye that would color European cloth came from Indian fields worked by Indian hands for British profit. In April 1917, Gandhi finally went to Champaran. He began interviewing farmers, recording their testimonies. The British authorities panicked. An order arrived while Gandhi was traveling to a village, sitting atop an elephant that swayed through the Bihar countryside. Leave the district immediately. In court, Gandhi read a statement that would echo across India. He had come to render humanitarian and national service. Now he faced two duties that pulled in opposite directions: obey the law, or listen to his conscience and serve the oppressed peasants. He chose his conscience. He pleaded guilty to disobeying the order. The government hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the crowds that gathered outside the courthouse either. Thousands of farmers who'd walked miles to support this stranger who'd come to hear their stories. The case was withdrawn. Gandhi and his team, including a young lawyer named Rajendra Prasad, went back to work. They recorded testimonies from thousands of cultivators. The evidence piled up like indigo leaves at harvest time. The government appointed an inquiry committee. They even put Gandhi on it. The committee's recommendation was unanimous: abolish the Tinkathia system. The planters fought it, but the verdict stood. Gandhi's first major victory for non-violent resistance on Indian soil was complete. Champaran changed everything. It proved that Satyagraha could work in India, just as it had worked in South Africa. More importantly, it transformed Gandhi from a leader of Indians abroad into something new. He could mobilize rural masses. He could make the British administration bend without raising a single weapon. The lawyer who'd returned home as a curiosity was becoming something else entirely, a force that would soon shake the foundations of the British Raj itself. Chapter 8. The Rise of Non-Cooperation and the Mahatma. In 1918, fresh from his victory in Champaran, Gandhi brought his methods to the textile mills of Ahmedabad. The situation there had a peculiar twist. The mill owners were led by Ambalal Sarabhai, a wealthy philanthropist who had once saved Gandhi's ashram from financial ruin. Leading the workers was Ambalal's own sister, Anasuya, brother against sister, with Gandhi in the middle. Each morning, the striking workers gathered under a sprawling babul tree on the banks of the Sabarmati River. Gandhi would speak to them there, his voice carrying across the dusty ground. Days passed. The workers grew restless. Their families were hungry. One afternoon, a worker stood up and spoke words that would change everything. "What is it to Anasuya Ben and Gandhiji?" he said. "They come and go in their car. They eat sumptuous food, but we are suffering death agonies." The accusation stung Gandhi deeply. That evening, he announced he would not eat until a settlement was reached. His first public fast had begun. The mill owners, watching their benefactor grow weaker by the day, finally agreed to arbitration. The workers got their raise. Almost at the same moment, in the district of Kedah, peasants were refusing to pay land revenue after their crops had failed. A lawyer named Vallabhbhai Patel, newly converted to Gandhi's methods, was leading them. The British authorities expected the usual riots, perhaps. Violence they could crush. Instead, they got silence, refusal. The peasants simply would not pay. Then came 1919, and with it the Rowlatt Act. The British government, grateful for Indian soldiers who had died in their war, showed their appreciation in a peculiar way. They extended wartime emergency powers, detention without trial, arrest without warrant. The very measures they had promised would end with the war. On February 24th, at his Sabarmati ashram, Gandhi drew up what he called a Satyagraha pledge. Those who signed vowed to disobey these unjust laws peacefully, to court arrest if necessary. He called for a nationwide hartal on April 6th, a day when India would stop. And India stopped. From Bombay to Calcutta, from Delhi to Madras, shops shuttered, workers stayed home, and people fasted and prayed. An Urdu weekly captured the moment perfectly. The hartal, it reported, had united the Hindus and the Mussalmans like sugar and water. It was during these extraordinary days that people began calling him Mahatma, Great Soul. The title stuck. The British response came swiftly in Punjab. In Amritsar, after protests against the deportation of local leaders, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer took control. On April 13th, thousands gathered in Jallianwala Bagh, an enclosed garden with high walls and few exits. Many were pilgrims celebrating Baisakhi, the harvest festival. Families with children, old men sitting in the shade. Dyer arrived with 50 soldiers. He blocked the main exit. Without warning, without asking the crowd to disperse, he gave the order to fire. For 10 minutes, his troops shot into the packed crowd. 1,650 rounds. When the ammunition ran low, they stopped. The soldiers turned and marched away. The Punjab Chief Secretary wrote in his diary that night, "Meeting held in spite of prohibition, 200 killed." The exclamation mark was his. A college principal told him the next day that the troops shot men down like rabbits as they ran. Official figures would count nearly 400 dead, over 1,000 wounded. The actual numbers were likely higher. Bodies had been carried away in the darkness. Some jumped into a well to escape the bullets and drowned. In the days that followed, Dyer imposed what he called the crawling order. Indians passing through the street where a British woman had been assaulted were forced to crawl on their bellies. The blood spilled at Jallianwala Bagh washed away whatever faith remained in British justice. Gandhi now saw the empire as satanic. His word, at a special Congress session in Calcutta that September, he proposed a program of non-cooperation. Stop working for them. Stop buying from them. Stop recognizing their authority. Opposition came from unexpected quarters. Established leaders worried about boycotting the new legislative councils. Even Annie Besant was shouted down. But by December, at the annual session in Nagpur, Gandhi had won them over. The Congress adopted a new constitution, opening membership for just 4 annas, creating village committees across India. Gandhi made a promise that electrified the nation. Follow this program, and within 1 year, we will have Swaraj, independence. The movement began with gestures of renunciation. Prominent Indians returned their titles and medals. Students walked out of government colleges by the thousands. Leading lawyers like Chittaranjan Das and Motilal Nehru gave up practices worth fortunes. On July 31st, 1921, Gandhi lit a bonfire of foreign cloth in Bombay. Witnesses said it seemed the entire city had gathered to watch. In the villages, something extraordinary was happening. Peasants in the United Provinces were organizing against landlords, invoking Gandhi's name. They believed Gandhi Raj was coming to end their suffering. In Assam's tea gardens, thousands of workers went on strike, telling managers that Gandhi had ordered them to do so. His name was in their mouths, one newspaper reported. His image in their hearts. Strange stories began to circulate. A mango tree had straightened itself by his grace. A man's ghee went bad after he mocked the Mahatma. In Gorakhpur district, an Anglo-Indian engine driver woke from a nightmare, shouting that Gandhi was marching at the head of several strong Indians, decimating the English. Local white families panicked, locking their women in boxes for safety. For over a year, the protests remained largely peaceful. Then came February 4th, 1922. In the village of Chauri Chaura, a procession of protesters clashed with police. The police fired into the crowd. The protesters, enraged, chased the constables into the police station. Someone brought kerosene. The building was set ablaze. 23 policemen died. Some burned alive. Others were hacked down as they tried to flee. When Gandhi heard the news, he was horrified. "No provocation," he wrote, "can possibly justify the brutal murder of men who had been rendered defenseless and who had virtually thrown themselves on the mercy of the mob." Against the advice of his colleagues, he called off the entire nationwide movement. Jawaharlal Nehru and others in jail were terribly cut up. They thought it madness to punish the whole country for one incident. The British, seeing the movement in disarray, arrested Gandhi on March 10th at his ashram. His trial 8 days later became legend. He pleaded guilty to sedition. He described his journey from loyal subject to opponent of empire. British rule, he said, had made India more helpless than she ever was before, politically and economically. Judge C.N. Broomfield faced an impossible task. "It would be impossible to ignore," he said, "that in the eyes of millions of your countrymen, you are a great patriot and a great leader. Even those who differ from you in politics look upon you as a man of high ideals and of noble and even saintly life." Then he sentenced Gandhi to 6 years in prison. In his diary that night, the judge wrote simply, "Golf before breakfast. Try Gandhi." Gandhi became prisoner number 827 at Yerwada jail. He settled into a routine of reading, spinning, and writing. Outside, without their unifying leader, the nationalist movement fractured. The Congress split between Swarajists who wanted to enter the legislative councils and no-changers who remained loyal to Gandhi's boycott. Even more damaging was the collapse of Hindu-Muslim unity. The Khilafat movement died when Turkey abolished the caliphate. Without a common cause, old tensions resurfaced. Bloody riots erupted across northern India. In January 1924, Gandhi developed appendicitis. After emergency surgery, the government released him, unwilling to risk him dying in custody. He emerged to find a political landscape transformed. The enthusiasm of 1921 had evaporated. Seeing the communal violence, Gandhi undertook a 21-day fast in Delhi. "My longing is to be able to cement the two communities with my blood, if necessary," he declared. Then he withdrew from active politics. For the next several years, he toured the country promoting hand spinning and khadi, preaching against untouchability, rebuilding trust at the village level. The spinning wheel became his focus. Economic self-reliance, he believed, was the foundation for true freedom. He was waiting, preparing, watching for the moment when India would be ready to try again. Chapter 9. The March to the Sea. The Salt Satyagraha. By the late 1920s, something had gone quiet in India. The great movement that had swept through the country just years before had splintered into factions and feuds. Gandhi had withdrawn from the political stage, turning instead to his spinning wheel and village work. The Congress party bickered among themselves, while the British administrators went about their business, collecting their taxes and running their courts, as if nothing had ever threatened their rule. But Gandhi was watching. He'd been searching for something specific, not just another cause, but the right cause. Something so simple, so universal, that every person in India would understand it instantly. He found it in salt. Salt. A handful of crystals that cost almost nothing to produce. Every human body needed it to survive. Every meal required it. The poorest laborer sweating in the fields needed more of it than the richest merchant sitting in shade. And the British had declared that no Indian could make it, sell it, or even pick it up from the beach where the sea left it freely every day. They taxed it, controlled it, monopolized it. Gandhi had been thinking about this for over a decade. Back in 1919, while recovering from surgery, people heard him murmuring in his fevered sleep, "How could there be a tax on salt so indispensable to human life?" Now, 11 years later, he decided to answer his own question. He would walk to the sea and pick up salt. That was it. That was the entire plan. His closest allies thought he'd lost his mind. Motilal Nehru called the idea quixotic. Sarojini Naidu, the poet who would later follow him every step of the way, privately mocked the notion of launching a revolution over table salt. The British officials, when they heard about it, could barely contain their amusement. Let the old man walk, they thought. Let him tire himself out on some meaningless gesture. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi set out from his Sabarmati ashram. 78 volunteers walked with him, carefully chosen for their dedication to non-violence. Gandhi was 61 years old, his body weathered by years of fasting and imprisonment. He carried a bamboo staff and wore his simple white dhoti. The destination was Dandi, a coastal village 240 miles away. The first day, they walked through familiar villages near the ashram. By the second day, word had spread. By the third, the roads were lined with people. They came from everywhere, farmers leaving their fields, shopkeepers closing their stores, women carrying their children. They threw flowers and green leaves on the dusty path. They fell at Gandhi's feet. Village headmen, seeing him approach, walked out to meet him and resigned their government positions on the spot, tossing their official turbans into the growing crowds. Each evening, Gandhi would stop in a village and speak, not just about salt, but about everything salt represented, about dignity, about the right of a people to the resources of their own land. He talked about untouchability, about Hindu-Muslim unity, about the spinning wheel and self-reliance. The march became a moving university, a daily lesson in freedom that rolled through the countryside of Gujarat. The press followed every step. Indian newspapers compared Gandhi to Rama marching to Lanka, to Moses leading his people toward liberation. Time magazine, on the other hand, described him as a spindly saint whose bizarre procession would soon peter out in the heat. British officials telegrammed each other with barely concealed relief. If this was Gandhi's big move, they had nothing to worry about. But something was building. You could feel it in the crowds that grew larger each day. You could see it in the way young men looked at the police, not with fear anymore, but with something like pity. You could hear it in the songs the marchers sang, ancient hymns that suddenly sounded like revolution. They reached Dandi on April 6, 1930. Gandhi had chosen the date deliberately. It was the anniversary of the Rowlatt Satyagraha, that first great wave of resistance back in 1919. The marchers spent the night in prayer. At dawn, Gandhi walked to the beach. The entire nation seemed to hold its breath. He bent down and picked up a handful of salt-encrusted mud. That was all. Sarojini Naidu, who had traveled to witness this moment she'd once mocked, cried out, "Hail, lawbreaker!" And with that single gesture, that tiny fistful of illegal salt, Gandhi lit a fuse that ran through every village and city in India. Within days, the entire country was breaking the salt laws. People boiled seawater in their courtyards. They sold illegal salt in the markets. Women, whom Gandhi had initially asked to stay home, poured into the streets in numbers that stunned everyone. They picketed liquor shops and stores selling British cloth. The jails began to fill, first hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Jawaharlal Nehru was arrested, then more Congress leaders, then Gandhi himself in early May. But the movement didn't need its leaders anymore. It had become something larger, something that belonged to everyone. The most shocking moment came at the Darasana Salt Works, a government depot north of Bombay. Sarojini Naidu led 2,500 volunteers in a non-violent raid. They walked forward in columns toward the salt works. The police were waiting with steel-tipped clubs. What happened next was witnessed by Webb Miller, an American journalist. The volunteers walked forward. The police swung their clubs. The volunteers fell. More walked forward. The clubs swung again. Miller watched men's skulls being fractured, saw them falling unconscious into the dust, blood streaming from their heads. Not one of them raised a hand in defense. Not one stepped out of line. They kept walking forward into the clubs until they couldn't walk anymore. Miller cabled his report around the world. He wrote that he had witnessed the most brutal example of police force that I have ever seen used. He described the sickening whack of clubs on unprotected skulls, unresisting men being methodically bashed into a bloody pulp. Neagli Farson, another foreign correspondent, confirmed every word. The reports appeared in newspapers from London to New York to Tokyo. The empire had revealed itself, not as a civilizing force, not as a benevolent administrator, but as an occupier that would club unarmed men for picking up salt from a beach. The moral foundation of British rule, already shaky, crumbled entirely. The Salt March had done something remarkable. Without firing a shot, without raising a fist, it had shown the world what empire really looked like when you stripped away the ceremonies and the rhetoric. It looked like police officers splitting the skulls of men who wanted to make salt. It looked like prison cells packed with people whose only crime was boiling seawater. The British government, facing condemnation from every corner of the globe, realized they had to negotiate. They released Gandhi from prison. They agreed to talks. The man they'd dismissed as a half-naked fakir would soon be sailing to London, invited to sit at the same table as the Viceroy to discuss the future of India. The empire that had seemed eternal just months before was now bargaining with the people it had tried to crush. Chapter 10. Gandhi in London and the Round Table Conference. The SS Rajputana cut through the Arabian Sea in 1931, carrying aboard it perhaps the most unusual diplomat in history. While first-class passengers dined on fine china and slept in feather beds, Gandhi had chosen second class, sleeping on the open deck under the stars. He held his prayer meetings there too, spinning his wheel as the ship rolled, this semi-naked figure amongst the formally dressed passengers, who watched him with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment. He was sailing to London for the second Round Table Conference, his first visit in over 15 years. As the sole representative of the Indian National Congress, he carried the hopes of 300 million Indians with him. But Gandhi being Gandhi, he travelled light, a few loincloths, his spinning wheel, some goat's milk. When the ship docked in England, officials offered him a suite at the Ritz. He turned it down flat. Instead, he made his way to Kingsley Hall, a Quaker settlement run by Muriel Lester in London's East End, where the poor lived packed into tenements and the air smelled of coal, smoke, and cabbage. This was where he wanted to stay, among the same class of people as those he represented back in India. His daily routine quickly became the talk of London. He'd rise at 4 in the morning for prayers, then walk through the quiet streets while the city still slept. Milkmen would wave. Newspaper boys would call out greetings. Within days, crowds of children began following him through the streets, and he'd joke with them, his toothless smile and twinkling eyes winning them over completely. The Communist Party wasn't impressed. They distributed leaflets calling his visit a ploy to throw dust in the eyes of British workers. But the workers themselves seemed rather charmed by this strange little man in his loincloth, who spoke to them about spinning wheels and village life. Meanwhile, at St. James's Palace, the political negotiations were turning into a disaster. Gandhi insisted that Congress represented all of India, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and the so-called Untouchables. The other Indian delegates nearly laughed him out of the room. The Muslim League representatives said he spoke only for Hindus. The princes said he spoke for no one but agitators. The fiercest clash came with Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, who demanded separate electorates for the depressed classes. Ambedkar argued that without their own representatives, the Untouchables would forever remain under the boot of the caste Hindu majority. Gandhi was horrified. Separate electorates would permanently divide Hindu society, he believed. If I was the only person to resist this thing, he told the conference, I would resist it with my life. The conference ended in complete deadlock. No agreement on a constitution, no path to independence. Politically, the trip was a failure. But Gandhi had another mission in England, and at this he proved remarkably successful. On weekends, he travelled to Lancashire. where textile workers had been devastated by Congress's boycott of foreign cloth. These were the people whose jobs had vanished because Indians refused to buy British cotton. He expected anger. He found curiosity instead. He spoke to unemployed weavers with genuine empathy, explaining that his goal wasn't to harm them, but to feed the starving millions in India who needed to spin their own cloth to survive. The workers listened. Some nodded. Many shook his hand afterward. At Oxford and Cambridge, he engaged in spirited debates with students and professors. The master of Balliol's daughter later recalled the household's fascination with Gandhi's routine. Baths at 3 a.m, prayers before dawn. Her nurse protested indignantly when she found Gandhi's dhoti hanging to dry in front of her gas fire. He met Charlie Chaplin, though he'd never heard of him. George Bernard Shaw emerged from their meeting to tell reporters he'd just met the second greatest man in the world. When Gandhi visited King George V at Buckingham Palace in his usual attire, a reporter supposedly asked if he felt underdressed. "The king had on enough for the two of us," Gandhi reportedly replied. After 3 months in England, Gandhi sailed home without a political settlement, but having accomplished something perhaps more valuable. He'd shown the British people the moral force of India's independence movement. He'd put a human face on what had been, for many, just another colonial problem. Back in India, he found the political situation deteriorating rapidly. The new viceroy, Lord Willingdon, had no interest in maintaining Irwin's truce. A fresh wave of repression was already beginning. Soon, Gandhi would be back in Yerwada jail, and the unresolved question of separate electorates would push him toward the most dramatic fast of his career. Chapter 11. The Fight Against Untouchability. August 1932. Ramsay MacDonald's announcement arrived at Yerwada jail like a stone dropped into still water. The British Prime Minister had granted separate electorates to the depressed classes. Gandhi read the document in his cell and saw something that made his blood run cold. Not political progress, but what he called the vivisection and disruption of Hinduism itself. From behind prison walls, Gandhi wrote to MacDonald with an ultimatum that stunned even his closest allies. Unless the decision was reversed, he would begin a perpetual fast unto death. This wasn't aimed at the British. It was something far more radical, an appeal to the conscience of his fellow Hindus to root out the sin of untouchability. In Bombay, Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar received news of Gandhi's threat, with astonishment turning to anger. Here was a man born into the lowest rungs of Hindu society, who had clawed his way to education and prominence despite a system designed to crush him at every turn. Separate electorates weren't just political machinery to Ambedkar. They were oxygen for a people suffocating under centuries of oppression. "I can never consent to deliver my people bound hand and foot to the caste Hindus for generations to come," Ambedkar declared. His words carried the weight of personal experience, memories of being thrown out of bullock carts, barred from schools, forbidden from drawing water from public wells. Many Mahatmas had come and gone, he observed with bitter precision, but the untouchables had remained untouchables. September 20th, noon. Gandhi began his fast. Within hours, his health started its predictable decline, pulse weakening, kidneys straining. But something unexpected began happening across India. In Bombay, temple doors that had been barred for centuries swung open. In Calcutta, Brahmins were sharing water with untouchables at public wells. In Banaras, the holy city itself was witnessing scenes that would have been unthinkable weeks before. The pressure on Ambedkar was crushing. Every hour brought telegrams, visitors, pleas, save the Mahatma. The nation depends on you. Your people need you to compromise. He faced a choice that no leader should have to make. Hold out for the political rights his people desperately needed, or be blamed for the death of a man millions revered as a saint. He traveled to Pune for negotiations with caste Hindu leaders. Madan Mohan Malaviya was there, Chakravarti Rajagopalachari too. The discussions were brutal. Ambedkar and his colleagues fought, as observers noted, every inch of the ground. Reserved seats, voting procedures, safeguards. Nothing was given easily. Then came the moment at Gandhi's bedside. The Mahatma was visibly weakened, his voice barely above a whisper. Ambedkar spoke plainly. I want political power for my community. That is indispensable for our survival. Gandhi's response was characteristic, both moving and maddening. You are born an untouchable, but I am an untouchable by adoption. And as a new convert, I feel more for the welfare of the community than those who are already there. September 24th. A compromise emerged. The Pune Pact abandoned separate electorates, but dramatically increased reserved seats for the depressed classes. 148 instead of the 71 the British had offered. It was a victory of sorts, though what kind would be debated for decades. At a meeting in Bombay after signing, Ambedkar made a surprising admission. I was astounded to see that the man who held such divergent views from mine at the Round Table Conference came immediately to my rescue and not to the rescue of the other side. Even in this moment of acknowledgement, you can hear the complexity, gratitude, mixed with wariness. Rabindranath Tagore arrived to sing from his Gitanjali as Gandhi broke his fast. Orange juice touched the Mahatma's lips. The crisis had passed, but Gandhi wasn't finished. He launched a new weekly paper called Harijan, Children of God, his new name for untouchables. Then came the tour. 9 months crisscrossing the country, collecting funds, urging reform. The crowds were enormous, their enthusiasm genuine. But so was the opposition. Orthodox Hindus met him with black flags in some towns. In others, they threw feces. In Pune, in June 1934, someone tried to kill him. The bomb exploded near his car, injuring several people, though Gandhi escaped unhurt. By 1934, exhausted from the Harijan campaign, Gandhi formally resigned from Congress. He retreated to a new ashram in Segaon, later called Sevagram, deep in central India. There he turned his attention to village industries, spinning wheels, basic education. Meanwhile, across the ocean, something darker was taking shape. Germany was changing. The world was tilting toward war. Soon enough, these distant tremors would reach India, pulling Gandhi back into politics at the very moment when history would demand its highest price. Chapter 12. The Second World War and Quit India. September 1939. Britain declared war on Germany, and in that same moment, without asking a single Indian leader, without even the courtesy of a conversation, Viceroy Lord Linlithgow committed 400 million Indians to fight Hitler's war. The sheer arrogance of it. Here was Britain, marching off to defend freedom in Europe while keeping India in chains. The Indian National Congress watched this imperial theatre with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Jawaharlal Nehru had been warning the world about fascism for years, one of the first international voices to call out Hitler and Mussolini for what they were. But how could India fight for someone else's freedom when it had none of its own? Nehru drafted the Congress response with careful precision. If the war is to defend the status quo imperialist possessions, colonies, vested interests, and privileges, then India can have nothing to do with it. Every Congress ministry in the provinces resigned. The British could fight their war alone. Gandhi's response was different, stranger even. He wrote a public letter to every Briton, suggesting they resist Hitler with spiritual force rather than guns. The British, watching London burn under German bombs, were not particularly receptive to this advice. By October 1940, Gandhi had crafted a peculiar form of protest. Individual Satyagraha, he called it. Not a mass movement that might disrupt the war effort, but selected individuals making anti-war speeches, then walking calmly to prison. Vinoba Bhave went first, Gandhi's devoted disciple, speaking his piece and accepting his arrest. Then Nehru, then others, one by one, a slow procession of principled objection. But the war was coming closer. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia in early 1942. Singapore fell. Suddenly the conflict wasn't happening somewhere else. It was at India's doorstep. And the British were getting nervous. American allies were asking uncomfortable questions about fighting for democracy while holding colonies. Enter Sir Stafford Cripps, arriving in India with what the British considered a generous offer: Dominion status after the war, with provinces allowed to secede if they wished. That last part was crucial. It was a nod to the Muslim League's increasingly loud demands for Pakistan, wrapped in the language of provincial choice. The Cripps mission failed spectacularly. Indians wanted control of their own defense now, not vague promises for later. The British wouldn't budge on immediate power. Cripps packed his bags and left. For Gandhi, this was the final insult. On August 8, 1942, at the All India Congress Committee session in Bombay, he gave perhaps his most famous speech. "Do or die," he told the gathering. "We shall either free India or die in the attempt. We shall not live to see the perpetuation of our slavery." He was careful to clarify this wasn't a call to violence. It was a call to unyielding, uncompromising, non-violent resistance. The Quit India resolution passed that night. Gandhi planned to write to the Viceroy in the morning to explain what would come next. But the British didn't wait for explanations. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 9th, police arrived at homes across India. Gandhi was arrested. Nehru was arrested. Every significant Congress leader disappeared into custody before the sun rose. What happened next shocked even the British. Without leaders to channel it, popular fury exploded across the subcontinent. This wasn't Gandhi's careful choreography of non-violence. Railway stations burned. Telegraph lines were cut down with axes. Government buildings were seized and occupied. In some districts, people declared their own governments, raising the Indian flag over administrative offices. The British response was swift and brutal. An official report would later admit, with typical understatement, that the disturbances were crushed with all the power of government. Thousands died in police and military firing. Over 60,000 were arrested. Entire villages were collectively fined. The Raj brought out aircraft to strafe crowds. The 1942 movement proved something important. Indians were ready to die for freedom, but it also opened a dangerous gap. While Congress leaders sat in prison, the Muslim League stayed free, stayed political, stayed active. They opposed the Quit India movement and used the Congress's absence to build their case for Pakistan. Gandhi spent the rest of the war in the Aga Khan Palace in Pune. Technically a prison, though it sounds grander than it was. There he would lose his secretary, Mahadev Desai, to a heart attack. Then his wife, Kasturba, to pneumonia. When the British finally released him in 1944, thin and grieving, he walked out into an India he barely recognized. The political landscape had shifted like sand dunes in a storm. Pakistan wasn't a fringe idea anymore. It was the question that would dominate everything that came next. Chapter 13. The Agony of Partition. The summer of 1946 arrived heavy with heat and dread. In the grand meeting rooms of Delhi, where ceiling fans turned lazily against the suffocating air, the cabinet mission had just failed. The British commissioners packed their briefcases and departed, leaving behind a country splitting at the seams. Muhammad Ali Jinnah sat in his Bombay residence that July evening, his fingers drumming against polished wood. The Congress had refused his grouping plan for the provinces. They'd called his bluff, perhaps. Or perhaps they simply couldn't see what he saw, that Hindu and Muslim couldn't share power in a single nation without one dominating the other. Constitutional methods had been exhausted. The pen had failed. On the 29th of July, the Muslim League Council gathered. The resolution they passed would echo through history. Withdraw from the cabinet mission plan entirely. Resort to direct action to achieve Pakistan. Jinnah stood before them, immaculate in his suit despite the heat. Today, we have also forged a pistol, he announced, and are in a position to use it. August 16th would be Direct Action Day, a show of strength, Jinnah intended. Muslims across India would demonstrate their resolve for a separate homeland. What happened instead would haunt the subcontinent for generations. Calcutta woke that morning to an unusual quiet. The Muslim League governed Bengal, and they declared the day a public holiday. Shops remained shuttered. Streets that usually hummed with rickshaws and vendors stood empty. By noon, the silence broke. Muslim processions emerged from the slums, carrying sticks and iron rods. Hindu shopkeepers who'd opened their stores found themselves surrounded. The killing began in the afternoon. Not scattered incidents, but organized slaughter. In the narrow lanes of North Calcutta, bodies began to pile up. Hindus dragged Muslims from their home. Muslims set Hindu shops ablaze with families trapped inside. For 4 days, the City of Joy became a charnel house. An anthropologist who witnessed the aftermath would later describe walking through streets where dozens of corpses lying about. They swelled in a day or two. The air became foul, and vultures for a whole week littered the roofs of Calcutta and feasted on the corpses until they could do no more. The Great Calcutta Killing, as history would name it, left thousands dead. But worse than the death toll was what it unleashed. Like a match thrown into a powder keg, the violence spread east to Noakhali, a district in East Bengal where Muslims outnumbered Hindus 10 to 1. October in Noakhali. A local Muslim League leader organized what he called retribution for Calcutta. Hindu homes that had stood for centuries were torched. Men were given a choice: convert to Islam or die. Women were taken from their families and married off to Muslim men. Ancient temples were desecrated. Families that had farmed the same land since anyone could remember fled with whatever they could carry. News traveled slowly in those days, but when word of Noakhali reached Bihar, the Hindu majority there demanded revenge. Late October saw Hindu mobs descending on Muslim villages. The mathematics of communal violence are always the same. They killed our people, so we'll kill theirs. Thousands of Muslims died. Over 100,000 fled their homes, many heading ironically to Bengal, seeking safety in the very province where the cycle had begun. Gandhi received reports in his ashram. Each telegram brought worse news. He wrote to Nehru with a breaking heart, "If half of what I hear is true, it means that Bihar has lost all humanity." Into this nightmare stepped Lord Mountbatten in March 1947. The new Labour government in Britain wanted out of India quickly. The empire was bankrupt from the war. Mountbatten arrived with instructions to transfer power and leave, whatever the cost. Gandhi met with the new viceroy and made one last desperate gambit. "Give Jinnah everything," he proposed. "Let him form the government. Let him choose all the ministers. The Congress would cooperate completely, as long as the government acted in the interests of the Indian people as a whole. Keep India united under Muslim leadership if necessary, but keep it united. His own disciples betrayed him. Nehru dismissed the plan immediately. Patel wouldn't even discuss it. They'd seen the bodies in Calcutta, heard the reports from Bihar and Noakhali. In Punjab, Sikhs had joined the killing, turning it into a three-way slaughter. The country was already at war with itself. For Gandhi, this was the end of everything he'd worked for. 30 years of struggle for a free and united India, and his closest allies had agreed to what he called the vivisection of the motherland. He'd once declared that India would be divided only over his dead body. Now Nehru and Patel proceeded with partition while he still breathed. The man who'd brought the British Empire to its knees through moral force found himself powerless to stop his own people from tearing each other apart. While the lawyers in Delhi drew lines on maps, deciding which villages would be Pakistani and which Indian, Gandhi made his choice. He would not celebrate independence built on division and death. Instead, he would walk into the violence itself, starting in those burning villages of Noakhali. Chapter 14. Marching for Peace in Noakhali and Bihar. In late October 1946, as riots tore through India, Gandhi made a decision that would have seemed foolish to most. The 77-year-old man, whose body had already endured decades of fasts and imprisonment, decided to walk directly into the violence. Noakhali in East Bengal had become a killing field. Hindu homes burned while their inhabitants fled or died. The old man packed his few belongings and headed east. His plan was audacious in its simplicity. He would disperse his small band of followers across the riot-torn villages, asking each to live alone among hostile populations. They would serve as what he called hostages for peace, their very presence a guarantee of safety for the Hindu minorities cowering in what remained of their homes. Gandhi himself chose Srirampur, a village where the Muslim majority had driven out all but one Hindu family. For 43 days, he lived in a simple hut with walls of woven bamboo and a floor of packed earth. Each morning, he would rise before dawn and set out barefoot through the villages. The paths were treacherous. Mud sucked at his feet. Makeshift bamboo bridges swayed over streams swollen with monsoon rains. Sometimes hostile crowds gathered. Sometimes they threw glass on the paths where he would walk. He kept walking. At each village, he held prayer meetings. He would sit cross-legged on the ground and read from the Gita, then from the Koran. The sound of both holy books being recited by the same voice in the same reverent tone created something strange in those tense gatherings. The terrified Hindus found courage in his presence. Many Muslims felt something they hadn't expected to feel: shame. But Gandhi believed the violence raging around him was somehow connected to impurities within himself. During this lonely pilgrimage, he began what he would later call his final and greatest experiment. He asked his young grandniece, Manu Gandhi, to share his bed. He wanted to test his celibacy, his self-control, believing that if he could master his own desires completely, he could generate the moral force needed to stop the killing. The reaction from his inner circle was immediate and harsh. His Bengali interpreter, Nirmal Kumar Bose, resigned in protest. His stenographer followed. Even Vallabhai Patel, his most trusted lieutenant, was furious. They feared what would happen if news of these experiments became public. Gandhi remained unmoved. He called it his yagna, his holy sacrifice, something he could not abandon even for the sake of his most intimate friends. After nearly 4 months in Noakhali, word came from Bihar. There, the violence had reversed direction. Hindu mobs were destroying Muslim villages, burning mosques, driving families from homes their ancestors had lived in for generations. Gandhi packed his meager possessions again and headed west. He arrived in Patna in March 1947. What he found there made him physically ill. Burnt mosques stood like blackened teeth against the sky. Muslim refugees huddled in camps, their eyes hollow with terror and loss. Local officials tried to minimize what had happened, but Gandhi insisted on investigating every complaint himself. At one point, he ordered wells to be excavated. The corpses of Muslim victims tumbled out, victims the authorities had tried to hide. At his prayer meetings in Bihar, he didn't spare his Hindu audiences. Bihar has sullied the fair name of India, he told them. His voice, usually gentle, carried an edge of steel. He reminded them they were honor-bound to regard the minority Muslims as their brethren requiring protection. He demanded they rebuild the homes they had destroyed, restore the lives they had shattered. His presence worked a strange magic. In August 1947, as independence approached, he returned to Calcutta. The city simmered with barely contained violence. Gandhi chose to stay in Haidari Manzil, a derelict Muslim house in Beliaghata, one of the worst affected areas. And he didn't come alone. With him was Hussein Shahid Surawardi, the Muslim League leader many Hindus blamed for the previous year's riots. Hindu mobs gathered outside, shouting abuse, but Gandhi held firm. Through sheer moral force and a brief fast, something shifted in the city's mood. As Independence Day dawned, Hindus and Muslims began celebrating together in the streets. Lord Mountbatten, watching from Delhi, wrote to Gandhi with something approaching awe. In the Punjab we have 55,000 soldiers and large-scale rioting on our hands, he noted. In Bengal, our force consists of 1 man, and there is no rioting. Gandhi had become what Mountbatten called a one-man boundary force. But even as Bengal celebrated, news arrived from the Punjab and Delhi. The capital of newly independent India was drowning in blood. Hindu and Sikh refugees, driven from Pakistan, were turning their rage on Delhi's Muslims. The old man's work wasn't finished. He would have to hurry to Delhi for what would become his final and most desperate attempt to hold his country together. Chapter 15. The Final Days and Martyrdom. Gandhi arrived in Delhi in September 1947 to find a city in flames. The capital was drowning in refugees from West Punjab, Hindus and Sikhs who had suffered unspeakable violence and now wanted someone, anyone, to pay for their pain. Tens of thousands of Muslims were driven from their homes. They huddled in the courtyards of ancient monuments, Humayun's tomb, the Purana Qila, places built by Muslim emperors now sheltering their terrified descendants. Mosques were being desecrated, converted into temples, or simply occupied by refugee families who had nowhere else to go. Gandhi took up residence at Birla House, a wealthy industrialist's home that would become his final dwelling. Every evening, he held prayer meetings in the garden. While the city burned around him, this 78-year-old man spoke into the gathering darkness about the futility of revenge. Retaliation is no remedy, he told the crowds. Attacking innocent Muslims in Delhi wouldn't bring back the dead of Punjab, wouldn't heal the wounds, wouldn't undo what had been done. He visited the refugee camps, both Hindu and Muslim, walked through the makeshift shelters where families crouched among their few remaining possessions, offered what comfort he could to people who had lost everything. This infuriated certain groups. The Hindu Mahasabha and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, saw Gandhi's compassion for Muslims as betrayal. The RSS chief, Madhav Sadashiv Golwalkar, told his followers that Muslims would have to quit the country. He spoke of having the means whereby such men as Gandhi could be immediately silenced. The violence continued through autumn into winter. Reports arrived daily from Pakistan of similar atrocities against Hindus there. Gandhi's heart grew heavier with each passing day. Then came news that particularly disturbed him. The Indian government, led by Vallabhbhai Patel, had decided to withhold Pakistan's share of the sterling balances, money that was rightfully theirs, being withheld as leverage. On January 13th, 1948, Gandhi made his announcement. He would undertake an indefinite fast. No time limit, no safety net. The fast would end only when he was satisfied that there was a reunion of hearts of all communities. This was his greatest fast, and it worked with stunning speed. The Indian cabinet reversed its decision about the sterling balances. Pakistan would receive its dues, but more importantly, the fast shocked Delhi into examining itself. Leaders from every community, including some from the very extremist groups that had been stoking the violence, came together. They signed a peace pledge. Representatives went to Gandhi's bedside and assured him that his 7 conditions would be met. Muslims could return safely to their homes. Mosques would be restored. On January 18th, after 5 days without food, Gandhi broke his fast. He had pulled the capital back from complete civil war, using nothing but the force of his own suffering. But peace came at a price. His defense of Muslims had pushed a small group of Hindu fanatics past their breaking point. On January 20th, someone threw a bomb at his prayer meeting. It exploded harmlessly in the garden. Gandhi refused to increase his security. He wouldn't have armed guards at a prayer meeting. 10 days later, on January 30th, 1948, Gandhi walked to his evening prayers as usual. The garden at Birla House was filling with people. He was running slightly late, supported by 2 young women who helped him walk. As he approached the prayer ground, a man stepped forward from the crowd. Nathuram Godse, a Hindu extremist from Pune who followed Vinayak Damodar Savarkar's teachings. Godse pulled out a pistol and fired 3 times at point-blank range. Gandhi collapsed, uttering the words, "A Ram, O God." He died within minutes. The assassination sent shockwaves across India and beyond. In death, Gandhi became what he had tried to be in life, a bridge between communities that seemed determined to tear each other apart. A Pakistani newspaper wrote that it would be hard to name anyone in history who had fallen fighting his own people to preserve the honor of a people not his own. The man who had spent 30 years fighting for India's independence lived just 5 months in the free India he had helped create. He died trying to hold it together. Epilogue: Gandhi in Our Time. The gunshots that killed Gandhi at his prayer meeting did something unexpected. They shocked India into silence. He'd once told reporters that his deepest wish was to cement Hindu and Muslim communities together with his blood, if necessary. Strange how some wishes come true. The man who'd spent decades trying to bridge the divide between these communities finally managed it, though not the way he'd imagined. His assassination stunned the subcontinent into a kind of exhausted peace. The killing rages of partition cooled. For more than 10 years, India was free from major religious riots. But fault lines don't disappear. They wait. By the 1980s, those old wounds had begun to throb again. The Ram Janmabhoomi movement wanted to tear down a Mughal-era mosque in Ayodhya. Violence was brewing. In 1990, an elderly woman named Dr. Sushila Nayar traveled to that disputed site. She was a veteran, Gandhian, someone who'd walked beside him in the old days. At the mosque, she held a prayer meeting. She sang Gandhi's favorite hymn, the one with the line that went, "Ishwar Allah Tere Naam." God is named both Ishwar and Allah. The Hindu activists jeered at her. When she explained that they'd come representing Gandhi, the reply cut through the air. "And we have come representing Godse." Gods, Gandhi's assassin. Today, there's a small cult that keeps his memory alive, celebrates him even. The political landscape has shifted. The Bharatiya Janata Party dominates, and their ideological parent organization, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, had never trusted Gandhi anyway. They thought his insistence that Muslims and Christians deserved the same rights as Hindus in independent India was dangerous, foolish. The revolutionary left had their own problems with Gandhi. The Indian Maoists, the Naxalites, saw him as an enemy. In 1969, the centenary of his birth, they smashed his statues across the country. One of their leaders, Kondapalli Sitharamaya, escaped from police custody and traveled 600 miles incognito. All that way just to reach Gandhi's birthplace in Gujarat, just to spit on the doorstep of the house where he was born. For the Maoists, Gandhi's non-violence wasn't principled. It was tactical, a way to suppress revolutionary instincts, keep the ruling classes comfortable. His religious language offended their scientific socialism. They didn't see post-1947 India as free at all. To them, it was a semi-colony, still dancing to Western tunes. Then there's the question of caste. This might be the most complex debate of all. Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar has become an icon for Dalits across India. The people once called untouchables see him as their true liberator. Many Dalit intellectuals look at Gandhi with contempt. They see a patronizing apologist for the caste system who tricked Ambedkar during the Pune Pact negotiations. Arundhati Roy called Gandhi the saint of the status quo. She said he was racist, that his views on caste changed at a glacial pace. But this leaves out inconvenient facts. As early as 1915, Gandhi declared he'd become an open rebel against Hinduism itself if untouchability was proven essential to it. Orthodox Hindus showed him black flags for this. They threw feces at him. Someone tried to assassinate him in 1934. The truth about Gandhi and Ambedkar is messier than either side wants to admit. They were rivals, yes, but their roles complemented each other. The social theorist Devanuru Ramaswamy Nagaraj once argued that Indian history, like the Ramayana, has room for only one great hero. Ambedkar was too proud to play supporting actor to Gandhi's lead, so he charted his own course, often against the Congress Party. Yet their debates changed both men. Gandhi became more radical about caste. Ambedkar came to see that moral transformation mattered too. Think about slavery in America. It took Frederick Douglass pushing from below and Abraham Lincoln responding from above. Similarly, undermining untouchability needed both Gandhi's internal critique as a caste Hindu reformer and Ambedkar's external challenge as a Dalit leader. Gandhi was a patriarch in his personal life. No getting around that. But he brought more women into public life than any other leader of his time. He attacked the Purdah system. More importantly, he made women central to his political movements. More women participated in the Gandhian freedom struggle than in revolutionary movements in China, Vietnam, or Cuba. In the 1940s and 50s, women like Sarojini Naidu and Rajkumari Amrit Kaur held high office as governors and cabinet ministers. India had arguably as many prominent women in public life as the United States did. He saw environmental disaster coming before most people knew to look. In 1928, he warned that if India's 300 million people pursued Western-style economic exploitation, they would strip the world bare like locusts. His methods traveled far beyond India. Martin Luther King Jr. adopted them for the American Civil Rights Movement. Lech Walesa and Václav Havel used them in Eastern Europe. Nelson Mandela employed them in the final phase of the struggle against apartheid. Albert Einstein, who Time magazine chose over Gandhi as person of the century, called the Mahatma the greatest man of their age. George Orwell wrote something interesting about Gandhi. He said that, regarded simply as a politician, compared with other leading political figures, how clean a smell he has managed to leave behind. This was about transparency. Gandhi lived his entire life in public view. His personal life was his political life. The world still struggles with religious conflict. Environmental crises accelerate. Politicians lie with stunning ease. In this landscape, Gandhi's ideals, interfaith harmony, environmental responsibility, the relentless pursuit of truth, haven't become irrelevant. If anything, they've become more necessary, more urgent. The old man in the dhoti still has something to say to us, if we're willing to listen.